All right, so what species is this? If you look at that, you should probably recognize that as a wolf. You might think it's a coyote. It's pretty big for a coyote, and it's got a really thick fur there, which has got a face that's more wolf-like. So it's clearly a wolf. And the question then is, where did the wolf come from? We know that corgis and stuff like that came from wolves, but where did the wolves originally come from? The same basic kind of process. The only difference is that there was no human involvement. There was no individual human being or group of human beings saying, I want to breed this trait, so I want this trait or that trait or whatever. Instead, it's nature. Nature becomes the breeder. And so basically that's what it is. Nature, if nature is the breeder, then we call this natural selection. Okay, so has nature been able to create any other dogs besides wolves? Well, sure, they created this. That right there is a coyote. All right, so, and they created other ones. Like, for example, well, this one's a little bit weird. That one you might recognize as a dingo. Dingoes are actually now feral dogs. They were at one time domesticated dogs, but now they're feral, running around, and now natural selection is acting on them again. What about this? Look at that, you might say, oh, it's a fox. It's not. This picture was taken in Africa. That's a golden jackal. And then there's this one, another picture taken in Africa. There's this guy here. He's got these giant ears. Don't make fun of his ears. This thing here is a really wicked dog. It's like a piranha on legs. And this is called an African hunting dog or an African painted dog. And those are just a variety of the different dog species that have arisen in nature. How many different ones are there? How many actual natural dogs are there? Well, there's a bunch. Currently, there's 36 that are recognized by the International Union of Conservation Naturalists, IUCN, and this is a subgroup of them called the Canid Specialist Group, and this is a list of all the different dogs that currently exist. There's 36 different species. Interestingly enough, those are not the only species that exist or have existed in the past. If we go into the fossil record, we'll find that the canids, which are the modern dogs, not only have the 36, but also a few that are extinct now. So the total is 42. But if you look even further back, you'll see there are these other dogs. There's one group called the Borophagines. These dogs are cool. Like this one here, Borophagus. This thing is huge. It's as big as a bear. It's a dog the size of a bear. It's extinct now. There's a bunch of, some of them look kind of like raccoons and so forth and so on. And then there's even these other dogs, these long kind of skinny dogs that are called the Hesperosionids. And the Hesperosionids are another group that also is clearly a dog, but very different in the way they're formed and some of their characteristics from the modern dogs, canids. And so there's three main groups. Two of them are entirely extinct, the Hesperosionids and the Borophagines. There were 28 known, 28 fossil species of Hesperosionids that have been identified so far, and 66 Borophagines to go along with the 42 of the canids, the modern dogs that we currently have. So natural selection has been able to produce quite a few dogs. And remember this, there's almost certainly other species of dog out there that we simply don't have any record of in the fossil record. And the reason is fossilization is a rare event, and it's likely that there's a lot of species out there simply because of where they lived or whatever that have a lower probability of being fossilized and therefore have not been fossilized and found. Those two things have to happen. Not only do we have to fossilize the organism, but some human beings got to go and dig up the fossil. So the point is, though, that even though these are the ones that are known, there's probably more. So natural selection was able to do that. How? How is it natural selection can operate? How can it work on these different traits and create from essentially a single common ancestor all these different types of dogs, this one, for example, compared to this one, the wolf? Well, if you think about it, look at the way this wolf is shaped. He's got really long legs, really thick fur coat, and these small triangular ears that are extremely densely furred. Okay, compare that, for example, to this African hunting dog, which has far thinner coat and much larger ears. Okay, now why does this guy have large ears? When I ask that, almost always I get the first answer as well, it has to hear well. Okay, I agree, it has to hear well. I don't disagree with that, but think about this. This creature lives in Africa on the savanna, and in the areas, the habitat that it lives in, there's not a lot of trees. In fact, you can see there's hardly any trees in this picture. It lives basically on grassland, and there are trees, but they're hundreds of meters apart. So this animal is standing above the grass and can see quite far. Now compare that to where this animal lives. This animal tends to live in the boreal forest. Now I'm not talking about the Arctic wolf. This is not the ones above tree line, but these guys, these timber wolves, tend to live in the forest. You can see the forest here. I used to work in those forests. I can tell you those forests are extremely dense. The trees are right together. We call it dog hair because it's so tightly packed, all the trees. Now, who needs to hear better? This creature, which lives in a really tight forest, or this creature, which lives in the savannah? Well, think about that for a moment. This guy can see really well very far away. There's nothing impeding its vision, whereas this one lives in a forest where its vision is impeded. So which one has to have better hearing? Well, you could argue this one should, because this one, the African dog, can see its prey, can see whatever it needs to see, whereas this one has to hunt as much by hearing because it can't see through the forest. Okay, so let's ask again, why are the ears different? Why does this one have short, triangular ears that are densely furred, and this one have big, huge ears that look like Mickey Mouse ears? Okay, why is that? Well, okay, think about this. These ears are produced by genes that this individual carries. Right? Remember, the genes are the programming. That's the program that tells the developing organism how to build itself. So it builds these big, gigantic ears. Is it possible that you could mutate those genes in some way to make this creature make smaller ears or have its offspring make smaller ears if the offspring's a mutant? The answer is yeah. In fact, actually, we kind of know a fair amount about how those genes operate, the exact genes that make these ears, and we are on the cusp of being able to manipulate that, being able to change it. Okay, so by the same token, could I do this? Could there be a mutation in those genes that make the ears that cause this to become like those big Mickey Mouse ears? And the answer is yeah, sure. Okay, so suppose that were to happen. Suppose this female here bred with this male here, and they had a mutant baby. The baby had a mutation which causes the ears to become big. Okay, maybe not as big and well formed as the African hunting dog, but still big ears. What if that were to happen? Well, that animal would be born in the spring, because that's when these guys have their puppies. And it would live the summer, have these big ears, and be funny, and everybody would look at it, and I don't know how the other wolves would feel about it, but whatever. But the animal would live just happily over the summer, then fall would come, then winter would come. And then this animal would have to survive winter weather up here in Canada, where day after day after day, the high is no higher than minus 20 degrees. That's the high for maybe 2-3 weeks in a row. And this animal would have to survive. Well, what's going to happen? Well, it's got these big giant ears, and those big giant ears are going to freeze. When they freeze, they're going to become frostbit, and that animal then has no more than 10 days to 2 weeks to live. The animal's going to die, not because it can't hear, not because its hearing has been impaired, but because the tissue that's still attached to its body dies. That's what frostbite is. The tissue freezes to death, not the animal, just the tissue. And then what happens is that tissue, if it ever thaws, which it will eventually, will become gangrenous, will become infected by bacteria. And those bacteria are the kind of bacteria that decompose flesh, dead flesh. And those bacteria will start to decompose that dead flesh. And eventually, they'll start to invade the living tissue. When they do that, they will start producing this stuff, which is gaseous, which includes chemical processes that kill the cells further. And it'll continue to eat away at that tissue and eat away at that tissue until eventually it causes an infection throughout the animal's body. When that happens, then at some point in the very near future, after that infection occurs, every blood vessel in that animal's body, every arterial, is going to go whoop and open wide. And that's a response to that chemical attack by the bacteria. The moment that happens, the animal is going to be dead in about 5 minutes because the blood pressure will go through the floor. It'll essentially go to zero. The animal's heart will be beating, but no blood will be pumping. There will be no pressure against it to beat. So the animal's blood will stop moving. When the blood stops moving, the brain becomes starved of oxygen, and the brain dies first. And that's it. And that's guaranteed. That is 100% guaranteed that's going to happen to that animal with these big floppy ears in this environment. I'm sorry, that's just the way it's going to be. There's no place that animal can go. There's no vet. There's nobody going to take it to the vet. These animals can't do anything to help it. And the animal's dead. So what happened to the gene that made that big, huge ear? Well, the gene died with it. Now the point is the animal is not going to be able to reproduce because that's its first winter. And these animals can't reproduce until the following spring at the earliest. And even then they don't. Behaviorally, they suppress their reproduction for a few years typically before they reproduce. So that animal dies before it can have a child that will carry on that gene for the big ears. So that's what happens. The ears are not big in these creatures because if they were, they would die. So why are they so small and densely furred? Because in the past, the animals who had the genes that made small, densely furred ears were the ones that survived because they were less likely to have this process of gangrene and frostbite occur. Okay, same sort of argument can be made here. What if this individual was out here with small ears? Well, it probably maybe or may not have been able to hear as well. It's unclear, but the point is, what are these ears for? Well, these ears are heat radiators. This animal lives in a really hot environment. And there's this really cool connection between the nose circulation and the ear circulation. And as you know, dogs pant to cool themselves down. And that is partly what this guy's doing. He's cooling himself down, but he's also using these ears as heat radiators. So an animal in this environment with small ears would not be as good at dumping heat, at radiating heat out of its body, and so it would tend to overheat when it got too hot. So what would happen to the genes in this individual, in this environment, for making small ears? Well, same thing. It's going to die out. It's a detrimental gene. It's not helpful. And therefore, it is going to die out and won't have the opportunity to pass that trait on to the offspring. That is natural selection. That's how it works. Now, in natural selection, we're not changing one individual to another. We're not taking one individual and giving it bigger ears. We're taking a family, introducing a mutation, and the mutation then causes the big ears or the small ears or whatever trait it's going to be, and then selection works on that. Selection doesn't generate that mutation. Natural selection doesn't generate the mutation. It only works on mutations that arise. And those mutations arise naturally and randomly, which is confusing because it makes people think that this is a random process because the mutation arises randomly. It is not. It is not a random process. I'm going to explain that here in just a moment with a medically relevant example. Before we get to that example, I want to organize our thoughts around these concepts. And those concepts that we've been talking about are often associated with this individual here, this gentleman named Charles Darwin, and another idea called evolution. And so let's deal with that. Let's talk about that here for just a moment. True or false? Charles Darwin developed the theory of evolution. This is something that's often stated, and it's often confused with some ideas like theory and things like this, and I wanted to address that. First of all, this statement, Charles Darwin developed the theory of evolution, is false. It is not correct that he developed that theory of evolution. And it's false really for two reasons. Importantly, evolution is not a theory. Remember, we talked about what a theory was at the beginning of the class to a scientist. To a scientist, a theory is a well-established explanation of natural phenomena using all the tools at our disposal. But the point is it's well established by evidence. Evolution is also well established by evidence, but it's not an explanation. That's why. And it is well established. I'm going to give you some of the evidence here in just a moment that we see in HIV. But the point is, evolution is not a theory, not because it's not well founded. It is very well founded. But it's not an explanation. It's simply an observation of what it is that we see. So we see things change, and that is the process of evolution. So evolution is a process, not a theory. The second reason is this: he didn't come up with it. The idea that we are associating with evolution is not his idea. You can argue that it goes all the way back to the Greek philosophers, although that's a little bit of a weak argument. But there are certainly other people before Darwin who brought up essentially the same idea of evolution. And in this case, evolution is simply change through time of the traits that we see in a species. Now I'm going to be very precise here in just a little bit about exactly what that means. But the point is that he didn't come up with that idea that things change over time. And again, the Greek philosophers, it goes all the way back to the Greek philosophers even before the birth of Christ, that they came up with that idea that things change. So that's not the reason why it is that it's so strange and associated with Charles Darwin. It's not associated with him because he came up with it. In fact, his grandfather, Erasmus, believed it. And so Darwin grew up in a household that at least one individual was very strongly in belief that species changed over time. But Darwin is not therefore associated with evolution. Darwin's associated with a different concept. He's associated with the concept of what's called natural selection. And that's what we've been talking about. Natural selection, like artificial selection, like we just established, is really similar to artificial selection, except there's no human involvement. All right, so that's the point. Natural selection is a theory. So it is correct to say that Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection, not the theory of evolution. But he's not the only one. At the same time that he came up with that concept, this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with it independently. Wallace was working in the Pacific, in the Philippines, and was working on all kinds of things there, beetles and everything. And he came up with the idea independently of Darwin. Darwin's is a little bit more mature and a little bit more all expansive than Russel Wallace's, but a lot of the way we talk about it now has to do with Russel Wallace more than Darwin in a lot of ways. Okay, so here's the thing then. What is the difference then between evolution and natural selection? That's a question we got to deal with then. If these ideas are not evolution, if these guys didn't come up with a theory of evolution, they came up with a theory of natural selection, what's the difference? Evolution is simply this. It's a change in heritable variation over time. In other words, it's a change in traits over time in a population, and that's the key point. It's not a change in the way a single individual looks. It's not the way a person changes over their lifetime or whatever. It is a change in a population over time. And really, when we measure it with this concept called allele frequencies. Now, I'm not going to get into that concept in this lecture. I will in the next one. But the concept of allele frequency is really a way of getting at the concept much more directly. So instead of it just being change in heritable variation, it's a change in the allele frequencies in a population over time. That's what evolution is, just change over time, but it has to be heritable. It has to be a trait. Remember, we defined a trait as any kind of characteristic that's inherited. Okay, so that then is evolution. So what's natural selection? Well, natural selection is the proposed cause of evolution that these two guys proposed. And the idea is what I just went over before in the previous examples with dogs. If we look at wolves, why don't they have the big ears? Well, because individual wolves that in the past had big ears that froze, died, and they couldn't pass their genes on. That's the idea. Now, Darwin wrote a book, and the book is called On the Origin of Species, and it had a subtitle. So it's like On the Origin of Species, blah, 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 and the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. It's actually a very nice description of what he's talking about, as long as we understand this word right here, race, to mean what it meant in 1859 when he wrote this book, and not what it means today in 2020. The idea of race back then is not the idea of race today. The idea of race today developed from the idea from back in the 19th century. But if he were to write this today, he wouldn't use this word. He would use something like family lineage. So it would be more like the preservation of favored family lines in the struggle for life. Okay? But that's what it is. There are certain families that have traits that are advantageous. Those families tend to outcompete other families. Now, I'm not talking just about humans. I'm talking about all organisms. And family is simply meant to represent physical, genetic relatedness. So, certain families have traits that are beneficial, and those traits then tend to increase in the population because they outcompete the other families who have traits that are less beneficial. Right? That's the idea. Okay, so we want to see how this works in the context of something that's important, right? Okay, so who cares about this stuff? Well, we care. Actually, these ideas run all through biology and all through medicine. And in fact, they're the key idea that I work on personally in my own research, right? And it's because they actually deal with and answer very, very important questions and a variety of questions. For example, you have reference to natural selection when we ask the question, why is it that species change over time? Okay, so what we're talking about is if you were, for example, to go back to Manchester, England in 1830 and look at the moths that lived in the countryside around that area, those moths would have been, and we know this because we have museum collections from that time period, they were light in color, light, and they were called peppered moths because they were mostly light but had a little bit of dark speckling on them. It looked like pepper. Somebody sprinkled pepper on them. If you were to come back 30 years later in that same area of Manchester, England, and again, we know this because of museum specimens, they were dark. They were all dark. And then now if you go back to Manchester today, you're seeing more of the lighter colored ones. Okay? Now there's an explanation for why all that happened. I'm not going to get into that explanation, but it has to do with natural selection. Why do species change over time like that? Now we're not talking about individual moths changing, but we are talking about moths changing as a group, as a population. That is different than this question, where does new species come from? We sort of touched on that a little bit when we were looking at the artificial selection in dogs. Is that Irish Elkhound and the teacup Chihuahua, are they the same species? Yeah, that's a different thing than saying, how is it that a population of wolves can go from light color to dark color or whatever in their fur? Okay? And that's even a different question than this one. Where do the different kinds of organisms come from? Kinds being a general term for what we call higher order taxons. These are groups of organisms that are above species, groups of species, for example. And so fish, where do the fish come from? Where do the amphibians come from? Or birds come from? Right? So we'll see some of those things. But the point is that that's the question. Where do all of these things come from? Right now, all of these levels, this is sort of the lowest level, the simplest level, the smallest level. This is kind of in between, and this is the big picture changes. All of them are resolved. Every single one. The answer refers to natural selection. So why do species change over time? We refer to that as microevolution via natural selection and other mechanisms, not just natural selection. We'll get into that later. Where do new species come from? Now, a lot of times there are textbooks, including yours, which tend to lump this level into this level, and I keep them separate because this, to me, is a fundamentally different concept, and we call that speciation. Okay, where do new species come from? That's speciation. And at this level, where is it that the big groups of organisms, all of the fish, there's many, many species of fish, where do they come from? How did the fish arise? And where do the amphibians come from? How do the amphibians arise from the fish? That's called macroevolution. Okay, now microevolution means small in scale and change, meaning the changes are not so big that it causes new species. It's this one species changing over time. That's microevolution. Macroevolution is how is it that groups of species actually arise? So this one species could give rise to a whole new group. All the fish or all the amphibians came from one particular lineage or something along those lines. That would be macroevolution.